Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. Today I'm joined by Dr. Martin Gibala, and we're going to be discussing interval training, specifically high intensity interval training, what it is, what you can do to incorporate it in your own training, the benefits of it, and so much more. We also make a ton of references to Dr. Gibala's book, The 1 Minute Workout, and a lot of his research. So you can check all of that out in the links below. I highly recommend you do. I'm a huge fan of his book. I know that you guys are going to love this episode, so enjoy. Dr. Gibala, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me.
So as we were talking, I've been a long time fan and admirer of your work and the studies that you've published. But for people who aren't familiar with you, would you mind kind of filling them in about who you are and all the amazing things that you've been up to at McMaster University?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an exercise physiologist. I have a PhD in human physiology. I've been at McMaster for almost 25 years now, and my research broadly is in three main areas. I look at basic physiological mechanisms. So what's the underlying molecular and cellular basis of exercise responses? And I'm interested in applied aspects as well, whether that be health-related outcomes, including in individuals at risk or afflicted by various chronic diseases, as well as performance in athletes as well. So invariably, our work falls in one of those three areas. And a lot of our work that's gotten some attention has been related to interval training, in particular, brief, vigorous exercise. And that's something, the more I learn about the athletic and scientific history of interval training, the more I appreciate it. And so in some respects, it's a topic that we rediscover every decade or so. So we often get a lot of credit, but I think that credit sometimes is misplaced because we're just often, as I say, rediscovering this topic, but often taking it in some new and different directions.
Yeah, definitely. And I can tell already that you're super passionate about the topic of interval training, so much so that you even wrote a book about it called The 1 Minute Workout. Now, I've read most of your book. I haven't finished it cover to cover, I'll admit. But for people who haven't heard of your book or seen that before, would you mind filling us in a little bit about what you have kind of talked about or what that book really what message it tries to send?
Sure. So really, it tries to convey the science of interval training, in particular these brief, vigorous workouts, and how they can be beneficial, especially for health. The title of the book, The 1 Minute Workout, literally comes from studies that we've done where we've had people do as little as 3 20-second very hard bursts of exercise and shown that can elicit some favorable health outcomes that many people are interested in. Of course, many people cite time as a barrier. It's an excuse for a lot of individuals, clearly, but there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that vigorous type exercise can be a time efficient way to train, whether you're an athlete or you're someone looking for just general health and fitness. I don't have a lot of time for, some people try to demonize traditional cardio, and then there's been a backlash against the interval training movement, if you will. We try to look at it as we're trying to expand the movement menu. Let's give people more options to choose from that are grounded in good science. And really, that's what the book tries to delve into, including considering applications in individuals who we think might not benefit or perform interval training, such as in a cardiac rehab setting, for example.
So you mean tell me I don't have to spend 2 hours a day working out to get results? What?
This is where it starts to sound like the infomercial, right? But, and full stop, the public health guidelines, which generally call for 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise a week, they're based on great science. But for those who don't have the time, inclination, might just be interested in trying something different, absolutely. Our work has shown that as little as, what we're studying now is something called exercise snacks, literally less than 1 minute bouts of vigorous physical activity spread through the day. And can that be beneficial for you?
And I would imagine, now I haven't looked at the research yet, and I know you're doing it. So I would imagine that would be very beneficial for a number of different reasons. In general, I think we find the more sedentary someone is, the more their underlying health is going to decrease. And I think that anything we can do to promote movement in general, even if it's not perfect, I think a lot of times we spend so much time concerning ourselves with form and technique, especially with something like running or sprinting, when in reality, we're probably not going to correct the way someone's run and sprinted their entire life in a matter of a few minutes, unfortunately. So I completely agree with your stance on it. Is I think we need to promote movement and find more unique ways for people to fit motion and exercise and activity throughout their entire day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You hit on a couple of really important things there, but the most recent iterations of the physical activity guidelines, whether that's the US guidelines for Americans or the WHO guidelines, they removed a previous stipulation that activity had to be 10 minutes in duration to count. And that was, I think, in part in recognition of some of the research that's coming out showing that, in fact, all activity does count, these simple messages that we've given to people. And particularly with this idea of exercise snacks or breaking it up, you sort of can have a dual benefit. One is the enhancement of cardiorespiratory fitness and some other markers, but you're simultaneously breaking up those prolonged periods of sedentary behavior, as you noted, which we know it's an independent factor for adverse health outcomes.
And now I would imagine that might even help people who are looking to gain in the performance realm as well, because there's a lot of people I've worked with in the endurance realm who their endurance training is like a 2 or 3 hour block of their day. And then the rest of the day, they're relatively sedentary. And I would imagine that it might be beneficial for them to sneak in some time in different heart rate zones throughout the rest of their day instead of just one huge spike and then chilling in zone one the rest of the day.
Yeah, and there's even some recent research because most serious endurance athletes are already incorporating some type of interval training into their workouts. The classic recommendation if you're doing a high volume is the 80-20 split, but there's not a ton of research looking at what type of interval training is best. And there's some recent work showing that more high intensity sprint type efforts. So we're talking here repeated 30-second sprints may actually potentiate performance further in truly high level athletes. We're talking about elite cyclists with mean VO2 max values of 70 plus. So that's some recent research that is tried to address interval training from a performance standpoint in very high level athletes.
I love that. I love that. Now, as we're talking research, I know you've done a ton of it yourself on interval training and endurance training. And I believe, was your original study using the Wingate protocol? Is that correct?
Yeah, it was. And so our first study published in 2005. So the Wingate test, some of your listeners may be aware, others may not, but basically it's a 30-second all-out effort on a specialized cycle ergometer, so a specialized bike. And it's, anyone who's done one, it's probably the longest 30 seconds of your life is the common joke, because it's extremely demanding type of exercise. And we were having people repeat those Wingates 4, 5, 6 times in a session. So that's only 2 or 3 minutes of very, very intense exercise in about a 20-minute time commitment. But, that work showed it was very, very potent to improve both your performance as well as elicit cellular changes in your muscle, increases in mitochondrial content and things like that.
Right, right. And I think that's what AMPK PGC1 alpha stimulation is the main mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, fast forward, some of the work by us and many others has been looking more at the effect of these brief, vigorous workouts on some of these molecular signaling cascades, because at one time it was thought that, for example, PGC1 alpha, you could only activate that protein by doing, prolonged periods of moderate intensity work. And clearly there's many different ways. I'm not sure that interval training is particularly unique, other than it provides a different way to stimulate the physiological remodeling process. And it appears to be able to do it in a particularly time efficient manner or with a surprisingly smaller volume of exercise as compared to more traditional moderate intensity continuous approaches.
So what would you say this means for, say, the average endurance athlete or even a high level endurance athlete, someone who's going for an Ironman or half Ironman, something like that? Are they still going to need to do a lot of low intensity steady state work? Or can they start to say, hey, instead of running for an hour and a half today, I'm just going to do a 20-minute run, but I'm going to do a very interval focused type of run?
Yeah, so I think that's the million-dollar question. We don't know, and it depends on so many things. And I don't want to hedge, but of course, a big thing that it depends on is total training volume. And so I think the traditional recommendation is still, again, that 80-20 split. If you're doing, 20, 25, 30 hours a week of serious endurance training, my personal opinion, and there's some research to back this up, would be that as total training volume gets smaller, you can have a greater reliance on intense interval training without sort of dipping into the overtraining, or overreaching phenomenon. So I guess that'd be point number one. Point number two is, of course, there's massive individual differences. And so you take 100 people who present very similar, you give them the same program, some are going to thrive, some are going to wither. And so definitely you need to find what works for you. But the short answer to your question would be yes. I think that incorporating more shorter, vigorous intervals can be particularly time efficient way to promote benefits, especially in people who I call them, serious athletes who otherwise are regular people. They're holding down jobs or families or things like that, and really don't have 30 hours a week to train like a high level athlete who only worries about training has.
Right, 100%. And now you mentioned about the need for individualization, which I completely agree with. Unfortunately, there's no magic formula, cookie cutter answer for everyone. Now, we already talked about the Wingate test and how that uses 30-second intervals. But I know that you've looked at other time periods for intervals as well. So for people listening who might want to take some of what we're talking about with interval training and apply it to their own, what other types of protocols should they look to apply, and how should they look to progress them? Should they look to change the interval duration, or should they keep the ratios constant? Should they increase the total time? What would be your kind of preferred progressions, I'll ask?
Yeah, and probably the attractive and frustrating answer is all of the above. And so I think, one of the things that and so, let's even take a step back. What is interval training? Really, it's just alternating periods of higher intensity effort with lower intensity effort or complete rest for recovery. Now, the devil's in the detail there, of course. Well, how are we defining intensity? Is it just based on subjective markers like RPE? Is it based on lactate or percentages of VO2 max? But I think for wherever you set your zones, you can think of interval training as falling within what I call green, yellow, and red zones. So green is sort of light to moderate intermittent exercise. The classic example for the average person would be intermittent walking exercise. But for athletes, it would be, low to moderate intensity sublactate threshold zones, sublactate threshold 1 zone. Then that sort of yellow zone is what we consider hard, vigorous, but submaximal exercise. So you're still below VO2 max pace. Maybe you're in the critical power zone, and then above that are red zone, or very intense, super maximal to all out efforts, that range right up to full all out sprints, that only last 20 or 30 seconds or so. And so I think for most athletes, they are working in that yellow or red zone when it comes to intervals, and probably the lower end would be repeated efforts that can last 8, 10, even as long as 16 minutes. And then the classic, I think, high intensity interval training for athletes are repeated 4 to 5 minute efforts, where you're eliciting at least 90, 95% of maximal heart rate. And then right to the upper end would be these all out 30-second sprints that we were talking about. In some ways, given these individual differences, and it's so hard to predict who's going to do well on one, it's a bit like the investing analogy. You want to spread your, you might hit a home run with one stock or one approach, but probably for most people, they're going to have a well-rounded portfolio that allows them to dabble in different areas. And that's probably going to give more consistent, steady returns over the long term. Ideally, you can dial it in and you know what really works for you. But for most of us, I think variety is best, and spreading out the types of loads and intensities is going to be the provide the most value.
I love the comparison to investing, and I find that true in a lot of senses in the world of health and fitness. Is it's rarely one specific thing that you do that gives you all the results. It's usually a combination of all of them. So the more diverse you can make your portfolio, the better you are to likely to do long term. And I think that we were talking a little bit there about um, changing the duration of the intervals. And that's something that I think could be applied beyond endurance training and even into the world of just sports performance in general. So if I've got a soccer player that needs to get ready for conditioning, hey, maybe one day I'll do 8-second bursts all out sprint and give them 15, 20 seconds to recover, because that's the specific adaptation to the imposed demand of soccer. And maybe some days I'll mix in some of those longer intervals. Sure, it might not be, you're not going to jump in a soccer match and sprint for 2 minutes straight without stopping, but the conditioning effect that that gives you will probably pay dividends as you're hitting minute 80, minute 90, and overtime of a soccer match, just using that as an example.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a great approach. And again, variety is key here. And of course, athletes, especially those involved in high volume training, any way you can sort of break it up, even to bring, the motivational aspect to prevent the boredom or overuse of specific motor unit patterns or muscle use patterns, may be beneficial.
Now, you bring up a great point there about specific overuse of a certain activity. And I know we've talked a bit on the running side and we've dabbled a little bit in the cycling side, but I understand that your research has looked at other things instead of just running and cycling. I think you've looked at stair climbing and a few other different types of endurance modalities. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And again, this is where, really depends on who the individual is. So if it's an athlete who's very targeted in a specific sport or event, these generalities may not be as appropriate. But for the average person who's interested in health and fitness, there's the old saying that I'm sure you're aware of: the heart doesn't know what the muscles are doing. And so there's many different ways to stress the cardiovascular system. And so I think for many people, that's an empowering message, because there's nothing magic about running. You can use stair climbing, you can use elliptical, you can use swimming, you can use ballroom dancing, you can use body weight style exercise, but many types of activities that don't require specialized equipment, don't require much space. And so, for a lot of people, they still think, well, it's not exercise or it doesn't count unless I change into spandex, go to the gym for an hour. And it's really just reminding people that no, there's a lot of ways to get vigorous physical activity into your day, and it doesn't have to be fancy. And probably varying it up is going to be, again, consistent message there, the best thing for you. That being said, if you hate running but you really enjoy swimming or ballroom dancing, make that your activity of choice to promote some gains in fitness.
I love that you bring up the ballroom dancing, because when I was in school years ago doing the ACSM book and all of that, I remember looking at some of the different activities they listed for metabolic equivalents, and ballroom dancing was on there, mowing your lawn was on there, riding a tractor, all these weird things. And at the time I was just kind of like, really? We're counting that as exercise? And now I'm like, hey, we're counting that as exercise. I like it. So it's amazing how the paradigm shifts. And I think another huge point too, you've kind of alluded to this, and I know your research looks at this a lot, is all of these exercise types of modalities are so good for your underlying health. And it doesn't matter if you have something like, say, type 2 diabetes. Obviously, you want to be safe. You want to take into consideration your blood sugar level. You want to consult with your primary care provider, all of those important steps. But you can exercise with type 2 diabetes, and you could possibly even prevent type 2 diabetes from developing if you do the right types of exercise. Or I think it's Verta Health is actually doing some work now to reverse type 2 diabetes through a combination of diet and exercise. So it's like we are literally using exercise as medicine, which I don't believe has ever been done to the level that we're talking about right now. And even if you are someone who's young, you're fit, you're looking for high performance, never forget the long haul and the long term, because at the end of the day, if you don't have your health, nothing else is going to matter to you.
No, 100%. And, many people discount interval training out of hand for individuals, unless you're a high level athlete or unless you're very fit. And, there are hundreds of studies a year now, literally applying interval training in various settings. I mentioned cardiac rehabilitation, but it's been applied in individuals who are older with metabolic syndrome, with type 2 diabetes, many different conditions. And again, not saying it's the best type of exercise for them, but just making the point that there's many other options that these individuals can choose from. Your point's well taken about ideally checking with your primary care provider before you start or change your exercise routine. But, big picture, people don't need to be afraid of interval training. And it's, the evidence now around safety are that it's, again, generally speaking, generally safe for most individuals to do, including those with cardiometabolic disease.
Yeah, definitely. And I would imagine you could even take it and apply it to, say, a resistance training type approach too. Like, hey, I'm going to load up, some bands or dumbbells or whatever, and I'm going to do this exercise for 15 seconds, and then I'm going to take a 30-second rest break. And then you can alter your work time to rest time accordingly as you progress. You can change the weight. There's so many different ways you can progress with it. And I love it because it's so different than what we've always done of sit there and count sets and reps over and over and over again.
No, exactly. I think body weight style interval training can be a tremendous hybrid, if you will. If you keep the rest periods short, you keep the heart rate elevated, and that provides a cardiovascular training stimulus, but you're getting the strength training benefits as well, especially if you're doing lower body exercise, lunges, air squats. It's not going to be the same, of course, as heavy resistance training, but for a lot of people, that doesn't matter. And so, again, these simple, practical messages, reminders that there's lots of different ways to do this. I used to call them hotel room workouts. Then they started, then it became COVID workouts when, we couldn't have access to anything else. But it's a really beneficial and valuable and approachable way to train. And again, how we rediscover things. In the late 1950s, the Canadian government came out with a program called 5BX, which stood for 5 basic exercises. And it was designed for service members stationed in the far north at the height of the Cold War. And, eventually it spread beyond the military and all these pamphlets were produced. But fundamentally, it was just a reminder over 50 years ago that body weight style interval training can be effective to promote your health. And again, it's a message we're relearning today.
Definitely, definitely. I got to ask, what's your own workout routine and your own exercise split look like?
Yeah, so I do a lot of cycle-based interval training. So the vast majority of my cardio training is on the bike. In the summers and that, I try to ride outside as much as possible. When the cold Canadian winters hit, it's inside. And that's because I'm a classic individual with knee osteoarthritis, so I just can't run anymore. I'm still able to ice skate, not very well, but I do play a weekly pickup hockey game. And so, that's my main cardio training. And then I really like body weight style interval training, but most of my own training is at home. I sort of have a classic garage style gym that's in my basement with a power rack and, kettlebells and a lot of the fundamentals. But I would say it's really basic style resistance training with cycle-based intervals is the heart of my exercise regime.
Again, simple, mastering the basics and getting great results from it. I love that. And I also like how you mentioned that, you have knee arthritis, and I hear that a lot, and people almost use it as like an excuse to, well, I'm not going to do anything because I have this. And that really creates a big downward spiral once people stop moving because of X or Y or Z. And arthritis is just the most common example I hear of all the time. So the fact that you're able to find ways to not only continue to move, but continue to challenge yourself while moving, because some of these cycle intervals we've talked about, especially Wingate, like you mentioned there, it is a long 30 seconds. And naturally, you can break up that protocol even to an outdoor bike ride. If you're going up a hill, well, it's naturally going to be more intense. And if you're on a flat ground, hey, push harder for 20, 30 seconds and then just kind of let it ride and take a little break. You can build intervals in any different way.
No, exactly. And we've touched on the potential for cardiac risk, and people need to ideally see their physician to rule out any underlying things. But another concern about interval training is often that it's more potentially injurious, especially for musculoskeletal or joint injuries. But that's where I think it really depends on the type of interval training. And so you can exercise very hard on a bike or other less or non-weight bearing activities, swimming, for example, and there's no greater injury risk than other routines. It's really the impact forces, with the sprint running and things like that, where the potential injury risk is markedly elevated, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you might have to correct me here if I'm incorrect or correct me if I'm wrong here. I forget if it was your book or it might have been Alex Hutchinson's book, Endure. But one of the books I was reading recently on endurance training was talking about how that whole idea of 10 out of 10 RPE, the whole concept of you're going to do this interval and you're going to push yourself to your max. It basically proposed that humankind is not capable of pushing themselves to that max level physiologically unless they're in like a life or death fight or flight type situation. You just can't get yourself to that level. And again, I don't know if that was your book or Alex's or another one that I was reading recently. But would you say that that would change the outcome of the interval training that you're doing, your overall ability to, for lack of a better way to put it, embrace the suck and push yourself to a higher, closer to 100% physiological load point, I'll call it?
Yeah, I guess my response would be, at least in my book, we do use RPE ranges to try and put various workout examples in context for individuals. And so, I do see a lot of value in RPE ratings, whether that's a 0 to 10 scale or the 6 to 20 scale, but even simply 1 to 10. First of all, it really individualizes workouts. But you bring up a great point, and that's, I think that for many individuals, they think interval training has to be this all out, as hard as you can go, gut busting type workouts, which, and many people may not be able to push themselves to that level, but it doesn't have to be that way at all. And so the classic definition of vigorous intensity exercise is 7 or 8 on a 10-point scale. And so it's many people can get to those subjective levels wherever their starting fitness level is, and it's not critical or important to be hitting 10 out of 10. Even occasionally you can have a lot of success with submaximal interval training, if we call it that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that people forget that piece of it, the intensity, because interval training for someone like me who hasn't been running in a few days, it might be from a brisk walk to a jog and then back to a brisk walk. And that is perfectly okay. You don't have to redline every single time you're doing it, per se.
No, 100%. I think that's a really important message that we can't hear enough.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that applies even larger scale to all fitness and training. I think a lot of people have this belief that if they're not going to the max, then they're not going to get the maximum result. When in reality, the majority of the research that I've seen across the board in endurance training, resistance training, all that sort of thing says you should not go to the max every single time you train. You should have a periodized approach or a scaled approach up to where you want to be, but you shouldn't just go out there and train as hard as you possibly can every single day, every single time.
Yeah, no, agree. And getting back to that investing analogy, I think, when it comes to training, the plan is a lot more the process of planning and adhering to a plan is more important than the exact precise details of what that plan is.
Right. As you were doing all of your studies and research, has there been any findings that surprised you or shocked you when you found them, or has everything kind of been, what you expected to see, I'll say?
No, we continue to be surprised. Often going into work, we have hypotheses, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, or we have to change them. But one of the things we're currently interested in is, there's renewed interest, I would say, in biological sex differences in responses to exercise writ large. And we know that there hasn't always been a lot of diversity writ large in exercise studies. There's a lot of studies on men. There's a lot of studies on young white males in particular. And females appear to respond differently to certain types of interval training, just like they may respond to certain types of exercise generally. And so, to give a specific example, in some of our studies looking at these very short, very hard sprint type efforts, it's VO2 max, or maximal exercise capacity, increases regardless of biological sex, but the way that it changes appears to be different, in that the changes in the cardiovascular system in the female participants is not as pronounced. So that, for example, the changes in maximal cardiac output in our studies tend to be lower in females compared to matched male participants. And so I think there's a lot of interesting work that needs to be done there still, just to give one particular example. And I think the other is, a lot of our studies and others are what we call small proof of concept studies. They're not the grade A randomized controlled clinical trials, but that work is starting to get underway. And we have currently registered clinical trials ongoing, multi-center studies to try and address these more comprehensive questions in a more comprehensive manner.
Right. And even if it's not a randomized controlled trial, I'll say that one thing I love about your research is the design and the methodology is done very, very well. And I've seen other studies that, unfortunately, they make a few errors. To me, anyways, there's some blatant flaws in the design and method of the study. And unfortunately, if you don't have a good study setup, then the results can be skewed, I'll say, one way or the other. And that's one of the things that
like other studies, we've been criticized for that too. And have all our designs been perfect? No, absolutely not. Right. And, we could go down rabbit holes in terms of sample size estimates and how you power and things like that. But, full stop. The initial studies are more what we call these proof of concept studies. And we're just trying to ask interesting questions, or questions that we think are interesting to us, at least. And then, you'll hear, in some quarters, the knock that, well, this is a fad or a house of cards. I mean, come on, right? There's just, hundreds and hundreds of studies now over dozens of years demonstrating the effectiveness of interval training in various situations. And again, athletes have known this for more than a century. So we're really taking new twists on, I think, fundamental principles that are already very, very well established, and some of those new directions are applying them in less healthy populations and trying to ask questions of, does the type of training matter to promote specific responses, whether it's a measure of blood sugar control or vascular, elasticity or something like that, or blood pressure.
Right. That's, again, one of the many things I respect about you is your willingness to really dig in deep on the study design. I thought everything that I've seen has been very well done. And overall, your willingness to take concepts like interval training and apply it to so many different populations, because unfortunately, as we mentioned a few times, fitness is not one size fits all. It's different male versus female. It's different with any type of chronic disease you add to the picture. So unfortunately, you can't take results from, healthy 18 to 20-year-old males and apply them to healthy 22-year-old females, or 40-year-old with this or 60-year-old with that. Everyone responds so differently, and that's one of the things that I've loved about your work. Is it just seems like you are very passionate about what you do, and you have been working very hard to find answers for all these different patient populations.
Yeah, no, you're kind with your commentary. I appreciate it, of course. But the other thing that I've tried to or I've gotten more interested in, I think is really important, are doing things like this, what we're doing right here. But it's science communication, it's knowledge translation. It's fine to have these theoretical studies, but unless you're really trying to translate the work, you're losing impact there. And so really trying to put the key results or the key messages from studies into hopefully messages that are accessible to many different individuals. And that's what I tried to do in my book, which was co-authored with a journalist friend, Chris Shulgin. And we tried to get that point where I was happy enough with the scientific message And Chris felt it read in an accessible and hopefully compelling manner. But we would have these real knockdown, drag it out, late night arguments as we were writing the book. And I'd say, but we have to say it this way to stay true to the science, to stay absolutely true to what we did in a study. And Chris would say, well, that's friggin' boring. No one wants to hear that. And so I think it's important for scientists to be able to get out of that comfort zone a little bit. And the way that we write scientific studies are very cautious, and we don't want to go beyond the data at all, or extrapolate or interpret. But you really have to do that, I think, if you're going to put it in messages, certainly for the general public, still capture the essence of what was done. But the way that you frame the message really needs to change, or otherwise it's just completely lost on people.
Completely agree. A true expert is not someone who takes something complicated and makes it even more complicated, but someone who simplifies it to a point where it still holds true, but is understandable by anyone. And I think if you can do that, then you're well on your way to having a great impact on those around you and those on a larger scale. Dr. Gibala, as we start to wrap up here, do you have any kind of closing thoughts, closing remarks, or any other points that you want those listening to really take away from our talk today?
Yeah, often the question will come up around weight loss or weight management, and I think that's where, as you would be well aware, the potential role of exercise in weight loss is often overstated. It's the energy inside of the equation more. That being said, exercise is crucial for successful weight management efforts, and so apply all of that times 4 to interval training. I think you often see the potential benefit of interval training for weight loss really overstated. Personal trainers will talk about the afterburn effect and this idea of heightened calorie burning and recovery. It's definitely real, but it's often overstated. And so I think for individuals, treat interval training for weight loss, weight management like you do other types of exercise. It plays a supportive role, an important role, but let's not overstate it. And I think that's where sometimes you'll see legitimate pushback around interval training, because experts will say, well, come on, right? Let's not overstate it or give people false hope here.
Right. And as you were mentioning before, that speaks to the importance of those movement snacks we talked about earlier, is just being up and active and moving as much as you can throughout your day, because you could probably, if you're doing a couple minutes every hour, you could probably easily put a 20 to 30 minute workout together every single day just by doing a couple minutes an hour. It's amazing how that can add up.
No, it will. And, to me anyway, arguably the most important measure for us is cardiorespiratory fitness. This is the idea of how well your heart, your lungs, your blood vessels circulate oxygen to your other tissues, but it's a really important health metric. And, to put it in perspective, the epidemiological studies would suggest that even having a 10% higher, roughly, cardiorespiratory fitness is markedly reducing your risk of all-cause mortality, your risk of developing many different chronic diseases, and that's a change that you can get in 6 to 8 weeks of exercise training, and you can do it in a time-efficient way with interval training, and that would compare to maybe a 5-point drop in your blood pressure, or 2 inches off your waist. And so when we try to frame the change in cardiorespiratory fitness to a change in these other health markers that we more traditionally measure in the doctor's office, I think it just makes a striking example of how important cardiorespiratory fitness is for health, longevity, much of the themes that you've been touching on.
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to live a fit and happy life, but it's also nice to live a long one as well. Dr. Gibala, for people who want to keep up to date with you, your research, and everything that's going on over at McMaster University Human Performance Lab, where could they find out more about you?
Yeah, so certainly you can go to my website, which is just martingibala.com. And I basically set that up to provide a little bit of background on me, but there's easy links to our work, links to other podcasts that we've done. And so there's a link to the book. There's also a link to a free online course that my colleague, Dr. Stuart Phillips, and I developed with some McMaster colleagues called Hacking Exercise for Health. And again, all of the content is freely available through the Coursera platform. So I direct people to that. I am on Twitter at GibalaM. I tweet occasionally, but you can also see some your touch base with me through that channel.
Awesome. We will link to all of that below in case you didn't quite catch it. Dr. Gibala, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan, again, and for your interest.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.